The year is 1986. The Nintendo Entertainment System is taking over living rooms, Top Gun is in theaters, and Chevrolet is still putting the engine in the front of the Corvette. But behind the scenes, General Motors was working on something that was remarkably similar to the C8, with one catch. It was 33 years too early. That car was the 1986 Corvette Indy, and this is its story. By the 1980s, Chevrolet had already been playing with the idea of a mid-engined Corvette for decades. The first Serve appeared back in 1959 as a single-seat vehicle, and then the Serve 2 followed in 1964. There were more experiments through the 1960s and 1970s, but none of them came quite as close to something Chevy could actually put on the road. In fact, take a look at the 1976 Aerovette, and you could almost put it in the same category as the Indy. Of course, they have plenty of differences, but you can definitely see some similarities between the two. By 1985, General Motors had a pretty interesting collection of technology available to it. The company owned a 91% stake in Lotus, and Lotus had been developing active suspension technology that originally came from its Formula One work. At the same time, Chevrolet wanted to promote its connection to IndyCar racing and the 2.65-liter Indy V8 being developed by Ilmor Engineering. General Motors was working on things like electronic throttle control and four-wheel steering too, so they decided to put all these ideas into one car. The project got the green light in late 1985. The Corvette Indy reportedly went from a clay model to a full-size show car in only 6 weeks. The design came from General Motors design vice president Chuck Jordan and designer Tom Peters, with the full-size clay model created at C-Comp in Turin, Italy. When it finally appeared at the 1986 Detroit Auto Show, it certainly caught a lot of people's attention. The Indy was extremely long, with the proportions of a serious supercar, and it sat less than 43 inches off the ground. The body itself used Kevlar and carbon fiber, built around a lightweight composite structure. The original concept didn't even have a passenger seat. There was just a single driver sitting inside the cockpit, surrounded by electronic displays and controls. As for the engine, the original Corvette Indy had a transversely mounted 2.65-liter V8 with twin turbos and 32 valves, related to Chevrolet's Indy racing engine. The engine was only there for display, so this first Indy couldn't actually run, but it was estimated to make around 600 horsepower. From a 2.65-liter engine in 1986, that's a lot of horsepower. The car had four-wheel drive, four-wheel steering, electronic traction control, anti-lock brakes, and electronic throttle control. Lotus also helped develop the car's active suspension system. Instead of using the usual springs and shocks, the suspension relied on hydraulics, controlled by a microprocessor that could react to the car's acceleration and adjust the wheels. Then you got inside and found even more technology. The doors had displays for the climate and audio controls, the driver had a CRT-based instrument display, and a navigation screen. That sounds normal today, but back in the 80s, it was a completely different story. Chevrolet was putting a navigation screen in a car at a time when GPS was still in its early stages for civilian use, and most people were still using paper maps. The Indy also had a rear-view camera that showed what was happening behind the car on a screen inside the cabin. The car received a strong response from both the public and the press at the Detroit Auto Show, and that reaction convinced General Motors to keep going with the project. 2 additional examples were built, with one intended mainly for publicity and the other used as an engineering test bed. These 2 cars were different in one very important way. They actually ran. Instead of the highly stressed 2.65-liter racing engine from the original concept, the running prototypes received an all-aluminum 5.7-liter V8 developed by Lotus. It used double overhead camshafts and 4 valves per cylinder, and it produced 380 horsepower and 370 pound-feet of torque. That was still a lot of power for the late 1980s, but the really cool part was what happened to that engine afterward. A version of the Lotus-designed V8 eventually became the basis for the engine used in the 1990 through 1995 Corvette ZR1. Just a fun fact before we continue. Yes, the Indy might look to some like a blatant copy of the Jaguar XJ220, but the XJ220 actually came out 6 years later in 1992. Chevrolet insiders claimed the running Indy prototypes could reach around 180 miles per hour and go from 0 to 60 in roughly 5 seconds. The four-wheel drive system helped get the power to the ground, and the tires were enormous for the time, measuring 275/40/17 at the front and 315/35/17 at the rear. The design was another part of the Indy that stood out. You could still see some Corvette in it, especially around the rounded nose and those big front fenders, but it also looked like Chevy was already thinking about the next generation. Some of those shapes would feel familiar when the C5 Corvette showed up about a decade later. The long rear end was there mainly because the engine was in the middle, and that part never made it to a production Corvette. The four-wheel drive system didn't make it either, so the C4 stayed front-engined, and then the C5 came along and did the same thing. Still, it turned out to be surprisingly accurate when it came to a lot of the technology it showed off. Electronic throttle control eventually became common, anti-lock brakes and electronic traction control spread throughout the automotive industry, navigation systems became normal, and carbon fiber eventually appeared in production performance cars. The Corvette adopted electronically controlled suspension technology too, although the production systems were much simpler than the active suspension used on the Indy. The project itself didn't disappear. The Indy eventually led to the Serve 3, another mid-engine Corvette engineering vehicle that continued the idea and used a twin-turbo version of the Lotus-designed V8. So the Indy was another step in Chevy's long-running effort to make a mid-engine Corvette happen. It would take another 33 years, but that finally happened in 2019 when the C8 arrived with the engine behind the driver. Now, I'm not trying to compare the Indy and the C8 here because honestly, that could be a whole video by itself. But after looking at this car, I can't help wondering how it would stack up against the C8. I know a lot of Corvette fans still prefer the C7 over the C8, so I'm curious where you guys stand. If you had to choose, would you take the C8, the C7, or this rare gem from 1986? Let us know in the comments. The information in this video was gathered from the sources shown on screen. As always, you can find the sources in the Google Doc linked in the description. I recommend checking them out for more details. If you enjoyed this video, there are a couple more on screen you might like. One is about the Dodge Diora, without a doubt one of the craziest Dodge pickups ever built. The other tells the story of the Ford Aurora, a really cool station wagon Ford built back in the 60s. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.